My name's Joanna. I work with SCAPE, which is Scotland's Coastal Archaeology, and the Problem of Erosion, although as you'll see, we don't actually see erosion as a problem. We're based at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. I've been with SCAPE for 10 years. Our raison d'etre is working with the public in research into coastal heritage, mainly archaeology actually. We are archaeologists. And I work with Tom Dawson, who will introduce himself now. You're on mute, Tom. You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, there's something a little bit odd with my computers at the moment. I keep losing the sound and it keeps going on and off. I was actually teaching last semester, and I hadn't realised that students had the power to mute you while you were talking. So I was like, quite often I honestly had no idea the university gave them that power to do that. So quite often I'd be talking and suddenly somebody else would mute me. Just shows you how interesting I can be, which is why Joe is giving the talk today and not me, but I am in a different room, but in the same country as Joe, and I'm Tom.
So this talk is in two parts, and the first part, what we've done is we've hacked a couple of pre-recorded presentations that give you a really quick overview of Scotland's coastal heritage. And then we're going to look at some of the factors that are most important in determining its vulnerability, and summarise the results of a 4-year community-based coastal survey project, which has really refined our understanding of what's at risk and where. So I'm going to be going into a video and then coming out of it. And in the second part of the talk, we'll go just live, and I've got a little PowerPoint, and it's a very short part, but what we'd like to do is really consider, first of all, some of the societal conditions that enable SCAPE to work as we do, and then pull out what we think are the most important lessons that we've learned in 20 years of involving the public in coastal heritage research and stewardship. Now, Tom doesn't know what the things I pulled out are yet, so it might be an interesting discussion, but really the whole reason why we've done this is because it's as the basis of a discussion with you in this group. So what I consider it important might not be so relevant to some of your situations. So hopefully we'll have a good discussion about that. So I'm going to go now. I'm going to attempt to go into the video now.
And before I do that, I just want to point out that I chose this music on the video and Joe was fighting for ages to get rid of it.
Yes, Tom is responsible for the music. Okay, here I go. So I hope that worked for everybody. Can anyone say if it didn't? I can't.
Yeah, it didn't. I couldn't see the captions, and we tested this yesterday, but
all right.
I've seen a load of pictures and not had any idea of where they were. But if you did see where they were, then that would have.
saw the captions on my screen.
So did I.
Okay.
Maybe it's because I'm on a laptop, or maybe it's just, yeah, hopefully yours.
Okay, well, anyway, that was a really quick whiz around anti-clockwise. And it really is, the purpose is to very quickly show you just the range of heritage that we have, and so that you can just start making connections yourselves with some of the heritage that you know best where you're from. Now we're going to carry on with a pre-recorded presentation where we look at our understanding of the coastal heritage resource and how we arrived at this understanding, think about the factors that cause vulnerability, and a little bit about what we can expect in the future.
What we can generally say about coastal heritage at risk in Scotland is that it falls into two broad categories. The first is all that is specifically maritime. It has a connection with the sea. So coastal infrastructure related to fishing, for example, leisure, the leisure industry. Defence would come into this category, so everything from Iron Age promontory forts through to Cold War remains. And these are sites that are constructed at the coast edge or go out into the intertidal zone. And social and economic change has meant that they're not used anymore, and so they're not maintained, and they're exposed to the full force of coastal processes, and they deteriorate very quickly. And we found in our surveys of particularly wooden remains in the intertidal zone and at the coast edge, for example, boats, that really they've reached a tipping point, and very soon these won't be visible anymore, and so they'll be lost from local memory. The second category is settlement or activities that are not specific to the coast, but are now in the intertidal zone or right at the coast edge. These are usually prehistoric sites, but we do get early medieval and Norse and Viking sites that are in this category. And they're now on the beach or in the intertidal zone because of their isostatic history. So in Scotland, Shetland, Orkney, the Western Isles and parts of the Highlands, we've had relative sea level rise since deglaciation around 10,000 years ago. And so prehistoric sites that were previously coastal but not right on the coast are now in the wave zone. So once a site is in the wave zone, the most important factors driving their vulnerability are the physical nature of the coast edge, and you can get lots of great up-to-date information from the Dynamic Coast project, and also the wind and wave climate. So west-facing coasts are most vulnerable, although bear in mind that they have been responding to these environments for a very, very long time, so to a certain extent they're adapted to do so. But any archaeological sites at the coast edge are very vulnerable in these areas. And it's the interplay of all these factors that explain why our coastal sites are at risk. So how do we know so much about it in Scotland? Well, it has been a long process. In 1995, then Historic Scotland took the strategic lead by commissioning coastal zone assessment surveys, and the last one of these was completed in 2010. Since then, Tom analysed the data collected by all these surveys, and he applied quite a straightforward formula of site significance and vulnerability based upon the observations of the surveyors to pull out the sites that were most important and most at risk from damage or loss as a result of coastal processes. Now, Tom pulled out around 1,000 sites that he recommended had another visit to update the condition survey and update the recommendations for action. So these were the most at-risk sites coming out of the coastal zone assessment surveys. And between 2012 and 16, SCAPE worked with a volunteer network across Scotland to verify the condition of these sites in the field. So around 500 volunteers were involved in the surveys. They submitted over 1,000 records of sites, and very importantly, they visited nearly 90% of the most at-risk sites that Tom had identified. So we had a very good evidence base upon which to base our revised priorities. The results of this survey was that the total number of priority sites were reduced by about half, but the proportion in each area remained the same. Unsurprisingly, a large proportion of our most vulnerable sites were located on soft coastlines, so sand dune or macha environments. But of significance are nearly a quarter of the sites located on what we call hard coastlines, but a very low altitude. So these, in some parts of Scotland, these are also very vulnerable to coastal processes. And these areas aren't very adequately captured in models of coast edge susceptibility. So the big question we had to answer was, why did we find there were fewer high priority sites? And by the way, by priority sites, I mean only the top slice of very significant sites. Usually they would meet criteria of national significance, and they're vulnerable to complete loss or large-scale damage as a result of coastal erosion. So firstly, around 10% of the sites had either been destroyed since they were first documented, or they'd been excavated and dealt with. Secondly, a national survey done over a short space of time corrected regional discrepancies and surveyor bias. And thirdly, in many of those sandy, low-lying areas, we did find more evidence that these coastal environments were more stable now than they had been when they were originally surveyed in the coastal zone assessment surveys. So one of the things that could account for this is a change in land use and land management practice. So for example, stock levels on the macha are generally lower now than they would have been 15-20 years ago. We also heard during our surveys, and this is a great advantage of working with local residents as volunteers to carry out the surveys, a lot of anecdotal evidence for much fewer rabbits around. So you can imagine this would have quite a profound impact on the ecology of like sand dune areas if there are fewer rabbits. And this has since been backed up by BTO mammal surveys, which have recorded an 82% decline in the rabbit population of Scotland since 1995. Now, this isn't because of myxomatosis. It's a new viral disease which transferred from pet rabbits to the wild rabbit population, and it's not yet everywhere in Scotland, but it is having a profound effect on some ecosystems. And you might ask yourself, when did you last see a rabbit? In some parts of Scotland, and particularly the Western Isles, the original surveys were carried out after a severe storm, the Western Isles hurricane in 2005, and then 10-12 years later, when we did the surveys again, the coastline had naturally stabilised after this event. So that does account for stabilisation along a lot of the west coast of the Western Isles. But this meteorological event doesn't account for trends of stabilisation everywhere, and so we did a bit of research on general storminess trends over the last century or so, and this diagram is very useful because, as you can see, storminess is very messy data, and you can put trend lines through it, but they must be treated with caution. But it looks like there was elevated storminess at the end of the 19th century, which I think is well documented, and also a period of elevated storminess around 1990-95. Now bear in mind that many of the original coastal zone assessment surveys were carried out between 1995 and 1998, during or just after this period of elevated storminess. But our volunteers carried out their surveys 10 or 15 years after this period of elevated storminess, and they documented relatively more stable conditions in our coastal archaeological sites. That's just a really quick overview of the main results, but you can download the full report from our website. And what can we expect in the future? Well, we know we have empirical evidence that sea level rise is accelerating. A rise in sea level of up to 90 centimetres in the Edinburgh region by the end of the century is perfectly feasible. It looks like we are heading down the high emissions scenario at the moment. So sea level rise in places like Shetland and Orkney will be more extreme. This study has recorded an increase in winter wave height, although the jury's still out whether this is natural variability or climate change. There is a lot of uncertainty around whether the frequency of storms will increase and the intensity of storms will increase in the future. But sea level rise alone will put more sites and a greater proportion of those sites into the wave zone more often. And even if we were to cut our emissions now, we're still looking at the next few decades of increased erosion and increased damage and loss of our coastal heritage sites.
Okay, everyone, I hope everyone could hear that and see that, and that comes to the end of the pre-recorded bit. So now I'm going to go back in and just do a normal PowerPoint. Is that okay for everyone? Can everyone see that properly?
I seem to be seeing a really close-up portion of a bar graph.
Okay, I'm going to stop share.
But the video played just fine.
Oh, good. Right. You'd think that these days that we would all just be doing this on automatic now, wouldn't you? But right, share screen. Basic. Oh, sorry guys. Right, stop share.
Take your time, don't worry. It seems like a million years to you as just a second to us. So take your time.
You almost had it, Joe. You just need to press
How's
on
that?
slideshow.
Yes.
There it is.
That's it.
Yeah? Are we there?
Wait, probably. I'm just seeing everybody's faces, but that could be my share screen.
It looks fine to me.
It looks great.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Right, so the pre-recorded bit, I ended with, it ends with climate change because it is such an important driver of changes which will affect coastal heritage going forward. But the principal factors of change remain structural geological processes, natural cyclical coastal processes, and of course, all of the other human impacts. And it's very important to tell the whole story because first of all, climate change has become a bit of a convenient blame for unsustainable human development activities that harm coastal environments, and there's plenty of evidence for that across the world in the UK and in the US. And also, secondly, this is my perception, and I'd be interested if other people are feeling this too. There is a narrative developing, possibly linked to anxiety about climate change, that it's desirable or it's in the natural order of things for everything to stay the same. But in fact, coastlines should erode and archaeological remains should decay. So acceleration of erosive processes is certainly a challenge going forward, and for some regions, much more than others. But I suppose one of the positives of climate change is that it introduces an imperative for action, which is why we're all here now. And once we're on the road of deciding what action to take, we have to involve people in that. And so these are societal decisions. So SCAPE has been involving people for a very long time in coastal heritage research, and there are certain societal conditions. Oh, it won't let me. Oh yeah, there we are. There are certain societal conditions that we enjoy in Scotland and much of the rest of the UK, which make our work quite practical and possible. So the first of these is that we have publicly accessible historic environment records. So in Scotland, we have a national historic environment record through Canmore, and we also have PassMap, which draws together designated heritage assets and regional data sets as well. Since 2003 in Scotland, we have enjoyed the right to roam. I think this is it's a wonderful thing to have, and not many countries have it. So it just makes our work just easier, more straightforward. Our volunteers can access sites safely and easily and legally. In Scotland and also in the rest of the UK, there is somewhat of a culture of volunteering, and volunteering is seen as it's supported by big organisations and agencies. SCAPE has benefited from funding, particularly from these three funders, and I'd like to pull out the first two, the University of St Andrews and Historic Environment Scotland, because their funding has been very much a long-term investment in our activities, and this has really allowed us to sustain our activity and so have more of an impact over the long term. Yes, and finally, this is mostly for our Florida friends, is that our volunteers are probably relatively safer when they're going through dense undergrowth where you're unlikely to encounter any of these things in Scotland. So those are some of the conditions that make our work, the way we work, possible. And we have learnt a lot of lessons along the way. And I've just pulled out, I've been very disciplined. I've allowed myself to pull out two main lessons in some different categories. And I'd like, first of all, just to mention a program we did here a couple of years ago now with our friends at FPAN and with Marcy, who was then at the NPS, called Learning from Loss. And this program really gave us the opportunity to consolidate and document a lot of the informal conversations we've been having with communities over the last 20 years. And that website will give you access to some of the material that came out of that. So starting off with what we've learned, starting off with approach. And here I'm pulling out at the very, very top, enjoyment. Through in nearly every piece of work we've done with people, and also feedback from interviews that we carried out with a cross-section of our volunteers, they identified ourselves as well, actually, enjoyment, interest, the wonderful feeling of learning something new, social aspects, personal development, feeling part of a team, working towards a common goal. These are the absolute most valuable experiences of being involved in heritage volunteering. The heritage is almost like, that's the focus, but it's all the other things that maintain people's enthusiasm and encouragement and actually result in good data. And secondly, a culture of knowledge exchange. So we've always been very, very open about saying that we want to learn about local heritage from the people who live there, because we don't know much about it. There is a great deal of local knowledge out there. We're very confident with our national and our regional overview, and I think we're also better as heritage professionals at assessing things like risk and condition, but we do lack the local history and site-specific knowledge. So every time we go into a situation, it's about an exchange of information. So those are the two I picked out in terms of ethos or approach. I picked out a couple which I'm putting under methods or practicalities. And the first of these, and I think some of you are well on this journey, is prioritize. So there are a lot of doomsday scenarios out there about the sheer numbers of sites at risk, mostly based upon quite simplistic models. And this can have an unintentional effect of making the problem just seem insurmountable. And I say this with experience because SCAPE was sort of in that situation before Tom did his prioritization exercise. It's such an important process because in order to do it, you have to think about why you're prioritizing and who you're prioritizing for. These are big questions. They're hard, but they're very useful questions to tackle. In our feedback from our Learning from Loss program, the general public are very comfortable with an expert role in making the first sift, like creating the long list or doing the risk assessment. And in practice, this requires a great deal of desk-based analysis or modeling. And this is what Tom did way back in 2010, quite a simple initial risk assessment approach. But I mean, I just read a paper yesterday from Michael O'Rourke about what they're doing in Canada. There's lots and lots of really great examples of risk assessments out there, and you just need to, use the approach that suits the data you have or the questions that you're asking. So that's the first stage. And the second stage, it really is essential to involve local residents and communities in when we're ready to take action or to decide on the short list of priorities, if you like. So you need boots on the ground. Involvement from communities is crucial and extremely useful. By prioritizing sites and breaking it down into local action, everything just becomes much more achievable. And Scotland, I think, is about the same size as Florida, so it must be about the same size as many states or even bigger. So if we can do it at a countrywide level here, at a state level, or at a regional level, it is possible. It's possible to do it. So my second big lesson, methods and practicalities, is about simplification. In SCAPE's early days, our forms, our site condition monitoring forms, were very, very long and had lots and lots of things to fill in and things to measure and things to assess. And as every iteration of our site monitoring and condition forms that we've made have become simpler and simpler and simpler. We're developing a new app now, and we're going to have a professional level and a volunteer level. And so that just keep it super simple for volunteers who really, what we want from them is photographs, updated descriptions, and also opinions. But I think as we go on, me personally, I really withdrawing from trying to get your member of the public to do quite technical, measuring or making decisions about condition. I think that's best left for a more professional user. That's not to say, by the way, that volunteers can't become professional users. You can have sort of super volunteers who enjoy doing the more intensive stuff. So finally, Sarah asked us to offer some thoughts about some of the potential main differences in approaches between how we do stuff in Scotland with the US, based upon, I must say, our very limited experience and travels along some of your east coast. I'd be interested in your views about this. I pulled out two. The first one, and I think this is the big one, it's around public access to archaeological information and site location. It's very difficult for a European to get their head around this, but I must say, across the whole of the United States, there are ingenious workarounds going on all the time to this. So people are finding a way. I'm pulling out here two projects we know best. Maine Midden Minders is a really good example of a truly multi-stakeholder initiative to learn more about the eroding shell midden resource in Maine, and of course FPAN. Now, both of these examples get around the issue by controlling access to information, but there is such a fundamental issue here of really how can we expect the general public or the general community to feel a sense of ownership and stewardship over a resource that is largely hidden from them. And I must say, I think FPAN, I've been looking at the FPAN website a lot over the last few days, just thinking about this talk. And I think FPAN really are going to be trailblazers here, or are already trailblazers here, in that really pushing with this just this interactive map, just by putting on the historic cemeteries and the historic structures, but using a very open citizen science approach with the heritage that you can share. You're sort of shifting the mindset so that you're saying anyone can be involved in looking after the nation's historic assets. And this is a really important shift in mindset, because from that position, you can take a potentially smaller step to start including some categories of archaeological site where the risk of harm as a result of erosion, for example, outweighs the risk of harm from people knowing about them. So you never know. And then finally, one more. This came to me, it's sort of always been in the back of my mind, but certainly SCAPE's experience with the language of threatened coastal heritage has definitely shifted over the last 10 years or so. So our language at the moment is much more about the potential for individual and community well-being as a result of interacting with coastal heritage. So discovery, enjoyment, exploration. We've moved away from language of threats and urgency, which this wasn't always the case. In the early days, we were very much about threats and urgency because we were in an awareness raising phase. But now we're much more confident about very explicitly putting individual and societal well-being and enjoyment to the forefront. And this has enabled us to align with wider societal agendas and make heritage socially relevant rather than just being a heritage management issue. So I think that's something that we might all think about going forward. And that's it. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.